It began as an ordinary school night in 1999. Parents were leaving the open house at Maple Hollow Elementary. Teachers gathered their bags, ready to head home. Among them was Amy Whitaker, 26 years old, a second-grade teacher with a fixed routine. At around 10 p.m., she walked out carrying her tote and car keys. From that moment, she was never seen again. The school parking lot was dim, one light out, one camera looping on a 24-hour overwrite. A security guard later reported hearing a car engine turn over, then cut off at 10:05. But when he looked, the lot was empty. By the next morning, Amy's classroom was untouched, her lesson plans ready, her personal items still inside. Her Honda Civic had vanished with her. No signs of a struggle, only faint tire marks near a side gate. Detectives first focused on the obvious: a recent ex-boyfriend with a temper, a maintenance worker who knew every door and hallway. But neither fit the scene. Evidence didn't match their vehicles, their tools, their movements. Both were investigated, both eventually ruled out. For years, the case went cold, filed away as another late-night disappearance without answers. Then, 2 decades later, the lake near her route home dropped during a drought. Sticking out of the mud was a crushed bumper. Divers pulled up a waterlogged Honda Civic, registered to Amy. Alongside it, a rusted keyring and a paper carbon strip that should have been nothing more than scrap. But the strip carried a code, the exact code needed to cut a duplicate key to her car. Investigators pieced it together. Someone had copied her key, waited for the right moment, and silently driven her away. Witnesses recalled a white van near the school. Old receipts and tool marks lined up. A man once considered background noise, a traveling locksmith and auto glass repairer, suddenly matched every overlooked detail. Amy's disappearance was no longer a mystery lost to time. It was a cold case cracked by chance and persistence. And in 2022, after 23 years, an arrest finally brought the truth into the open. This is the story of how a missing teacher, a strip of carbon paper. It was late autumn of 1999 in Maple Hollow, a quiet town where nothing ever seemed out of place. The elementary school had just hosted its open house. Parents came and went through the halls, teachers spoke about lesson plans, and children darted around the corridors. By 9:45 p.m., the crowd had thinned. Between 9:45 and 10 o'clock, the last groups of parents left the building. Hallways fell silent. The school began to shut down for the night. At around 10 p.m., 26-year-old Amy Whitaker, a second-grade teacher, gathered her things. She carried a tote bag with papers, her lesson plans, and her car keys. She walked out of the faculty room and headed toward the parking lot, as she always did after late school events. Her route was routine, her timing familiar. Everything about her departure appeared ordinary. But the parking lot that night was not ordinary. One of the overhead lights near the third row of spaces had burned out. That row, Amy's usual spot, was left in half-darkness. Her car, a 1997 Honda Civic, was parked there. A small detail, easily dismissed, but one that investigators would later see as critical. The school's security relied on outdated analog cameras. They recorded on tapes that looped every 24 hours. Unless pulled immediately, the footage would erase itself by the next night. No one requested the tapes in time. By the time detectives tried to recover them, the system had already recorded over the crucial hours. What could have been the clearest account of Amy's final steps was lost forever. Near the west exit of the school, another detail stood out. The emergency door, which usually stayed locked and blocked by a wooden wedge, was found slightly ajar. The wedge, normally left in place, had disappeared. Paint chips around the frame suggested recent tampering. Not enough to break the lock, but enough to show someone had forced it open. At 10:05 p.m., the building's security guard, working a double shift, heard the sound of a car engine. It started briefly, then cut off. He glanced outside but saw no one in the lot. He later admitted his patrol had gaps. Between 10 and 10:15, he was busy finishing paperwork and didn't walk the grounds. Those lost minutes became the center of the timeline. By morning, it was clear Amy had never made it home. Her classroom was exactly as she left it, lesson plans neatly stacked, tomorrow's worksheets already prepared. Her purse and teaching supplies were untouched. On the school's landline, the call log showed she had phoned her mother at 7:12 p.m. and had messaged a colleague at 9:18 p.m. Nothing pointed to her planning to leave on her own. Everything suggested she expected to be back in that classroom the next day. Yet her car was gone. Her Civic, along with Amy herself, had vanished from the lot. No broken glass, no obvious struggle. On the concrete near the side gate, investigators noticed faint rubber marks, as if a vehicle had accelerated or braked hard. The markings were too light to match with certainty, but they suggested movement at speed. 2 blocks away, a street camera caught the blurred image of a white van moving past around the same time. The frame was distorted and unclear, but the outline stood out. It didn't belong to the staff or to parents attending the open house. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. Later, that single image would take on new meaning. Police set a 5-mile search radius along Amy's regular 12-minute route home. It was a simple drive through town, a straight shot to her house. Within that radius was Briar Lake, a small body of water off a side road leading to a boat launch. Early searches focused on highways and populated areas, not the back roads by the lake. It would be years before that choice was questioned. The night of November 1999 ended without answers. Amy had walked out carrying her bag and keys. By dawn, she and her Civic were gone. No one saw her leave the lot. No one saw her on the road. The evidence left behind, an open door, a missing wedge of wood, a dead camera feed, a faint tire mark, and a white van on a blurry frame, was all investigators had to work with. Her family reported her missing within hours. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors, interviewing the last parents to leave the event, questioning colleagues. No one had noticed anything unusual. No one recalled a van parked near the school. No one could explain why the west exit door had been tampered with. The first reports were cautious. Some suggested Amy had driven away on her own. Others thought she might have run into trouble on the road. But for those who knew her routine, that explanation made no sense. She had called her mother, finished her grading, and laid out her next day's lesson plan. She had every reason to come home. And so the question emerged. If Amy left by choice, why did her belongings remain untouched inside the school? Why was her car missing while her personal items were still there? The night of the disappearance raised more questions than answers. It was only the beginning of a story that would stretch across 2 decades, drawing in suspects, theories, and dead ends. A mystery that would remain unsolved until chance and persistence brought the truth back to the surface. Coming next, Part 2, the portrait of Amy Whitaker, her life, her habits, and why investigators believed she had no reason to vanish on her own. Amy Whitaker was 26 years old in the fall of 1999. She taught 2nd grade at Maple Hollow Elementary, the school where she had worked for the past 3 years. Colleagues described her as steady, reliable. Her classroom was organized to the smallest detail. On the night she disappeared, her lesson plan for the following day was already printed and clipped inside her binder. Student worksheets were stacked, ready to hand out. Her desk showed no signs of haste or distraction. Everything suggested she planned to be back in that classroom at 8 a.m., as she had been every weekday for years. Evidence from her calendar confirmed the same. The week after the open house, she had scheduled a routine dental appointment. It was written in her planner and confirmed by the clinic. That single note carried weight for investigators. People don't usually vanish when they're making dental plans. It showed intent, continuity, and a normal future she expected to live. Her communications that evening were ordinary. At 7:12 p.m., she phoned her mother from the school's landline. The conversation was short, casual, and gave no hint of trouble. At 9:18 p.m., she sent a message to a colleague. Finished the gradebook. Nothing alarming, nothing unusual. By 10 p.m., she collected her tote bag and keys and walked out into the parking lot. Amy's habits around parking were just as consistent as her teaching style. She always parked in the third row, under the same light post. On most nights, that small detail gave her security. On the night of November 1999, the bulb above her space was burnt out. That section of the lot was cast in shadow, giving anyone nearby cover to wait unseen. A coincidence, but one that mattered. In her personal life, Amy had recently gone through a breakup. 2 months earlier, she and her boyfriend had ended their relationship quietly. Friends said there were no dramatic fights, no lingering bitterness. She was single, but not socially isolated. Her circle was small: family, colleagues, a handful of friends in town. She didn't spend late nights at bars or parties. She didn't drink, didn't smoke, and rarely stayed out past 10:15. That consistency made her sudden disappearance stand out even more. She was last seen wearing her usual teaching clothes, practical and plain. Around her neck she wore a silver necklace with a single pen. The evidence tied to her life built a picture that was impossible to ignore. She had work planned. She had appointments scheduled. She had spoken to her family just hours before. She had finished her grading and was preparing for the next school day. She had a clear routine, a fixed route home, and habits everyone around her knew well. The portrait that emerged was not of someone trying to escape her life, but of someone living it steadily, step by step, until the moment it stopped. For investigators, that left only one conclusion. If Amy had not chosen to walk away, then something or someone interrupted her routine. That possibility grew stronger when they reviewed her personal items left behind in the school. Her purse was still in the faculty room. Her wallet and identification had not been touched. All that was missing was Amy and her Civic. In the early days of the case, some reports suggested she may have driven away on her own. But that idea didn't hold. Why leave behind her purse and plans? Why leave lesson materials ready for the morning? Why call her mother and message a colleague if she never intended to come back? Those facts contradicted any theory of voluntary disappearance. The weight of these details pressed investigators toward another conclusion. Amy had intended to go home that night. She had walked into the parking lot expecting a 12-minute drive, nothing more. Instead, she was gone within minutes. That contrast between the calm order of her life and the sudden blank space in the timeline made the case gripping. It framed every later question. If someone interfered, how did they do it? And why was there so little evidence left behind? Amy Whitaker's portrait was not that of a troubled young woman. It was the portrait of stability, and that stability made her disappearance in the shadows of Maple Hollow Elementary even more unsettling. The answers would not come quickly. For years, the case remained a cold trail. But one detail at the crime scene, overlooked in the first reports, would eventually shift everything. A scrap of carbon paper, pulled from a stack of recycling, holding a code meant for cutting a spare key. That fragment, ignored in 1999, would later pull the case back into focus and expose the truth. When investigators arrived, the first was the west emergency exit. Officers found it slightly ajar. Paint along the frame had chipped, showing fresh scrapes, as if someone had tried to pry the door, but the lock itself was still intact. The door hadn't been broken open. It had been nudged or forced just enough to give access. That alone should have raised questions about how someone got in or out that night. Instead, it was written off as wear and tear. Inside the security office sat another overlooked clue. On the guard's desk was a stack of carbon copy papers, scraps collected for recycling. These sheets came from a local car dealership, where key codes were printed and duplicated. Among them was one thin strip with a clear imprint. Civic 97, cut spare. Beneath it, a string of numbers, the exact code needed to cut a duplicate key. The sheet had no name, no customer attached. Investigators marked it as trash, not evidence. It went into the file as a meaningless note. The initial case file focused instead on a familiar theory. Amy had recently ended a relationship. Her ex-boyfriend, Ryan Cole, became the immediate suspect. Detectives leaned heavily on that narrative. An angry breakup, a late-night confrontation, a possible abduction. That focus pulled attention away from other avenues, including the unexplored carbon strip. The working theory was simple. If Amy had been taken, she was forced into a vehicle by someone she knew. The parking lot outside gave little help. A light rain had fallen after midnight, washing away most of the tire impressions. On the concrete near the side gate, faint black streaks suggested rubber marks, but they were too weak to match to any make or model. No broken glass, no deep grooves, no signs of a struggle. By morning, the scene looked ordinary. Security cameras should have provided answers, but the school's system was outdated. The analog tapes cycled every 24 hours, overwriting old footage automatically. No one thought to secure the tapes immediately. By the time detectives requested them, the crucial hours from Amy's disappearance were gone, replaced by fresh recordings. That technical gap erased what could have been the clearest timeline of her last steps in the parking lot. The guard on duty admitted another gap. With so little physical evidence, detectives leaned harder on assumption. Their early hypothesis was that Amy had been approached by someone she trusted, pressured into leaving with them, and then forced into another car. The idea of someone unlocking her Civic with a duplicate key never surfaced. The strip of carbon with the coded imprint sat in the file, ignored. The first surfaces followed that assumption. Police created a 5-mile search radius around the route from the school to Amy's apartment. They focused on the main highway and major intersections. Patrol cars and volunteers scanned rest areas, roadside ditches, and parking lots along the larger routes. Missing from the plan was a narrow back road that led to Briar Lake. Investigators dismissed the lake entirely. They saw no evidence of tire tracks or skid marks on the ramp to the boat launch, and without visible signs of a vehicle entering the water, they moved on. That decision shaped the next 2 decades of the case. By excluding the lake early, they missed the most direct place where Amy and her Civic could have gone. Instead, they built a timeline that assumed she had been driven out of town. In reports from that week, detectives wrote that the scene showed no conclusive evidence of a crime. They acknowledged the open emergency door, but said it did not prove forced entry. They documented the rain-washed marks on the pavement, but said they were too faint to link to a vehicle. They mentioned the carbon paper in passing, calling it incidental refuse. Every one of those details would later resurface as crucial. At the time, they were background noise. The missteps did not end there. By zeroing in on Ryan Cole as the likely suspect, police allowed confirmation bias to guide their work. They searched his home, his truck, his phone records. They pressed him on his movements, tested him with a polygraph, and treated him as the center of the case. Yet, while they were chasing a narrative of jealousy and confrontation, the possibility of a professional with access to car key codes went unnoticed. Looking back, it is clear the early investigation was defined more by what was missed than by what was found. A small-town police force, stretched by limited resources, relied on familiar patterns. Blame the ex-boyfriend, search the main highways, assume the victim was taken by force. In doing so, they overlooked the sign. By the end of that week, the case had already set on the wrong track. The ex-boyfriend remained the prime suspect. The lake was not searched, the carbon strip sat in storage, and Amy Whitaker, along with her Civic, had become another name on a missing persons list. It would take years, and the slow erosion of time, for those small details to return. But in November of 1999, the conclusion was simple. Amy had likely been taken by someone close to her, and the rest was speculation. That speculation soon became the foundation for the next phase of the investigation. The first suspect entered the spotlight, and the story began to turn toward him. In every missing persons investigation, police begin with the people closest to the victim. Spouses, partners, and former partners almost always face the first round of questions. In the case of Amy Whitaker, attention turned almost immediately to one man, her ex-boyfriend, Ryan Cole. Ryan was 27 in 1999. He worked as a local mechanic, well known in Briarwood for fixing trucks and restoring old engines. He and Amy had dated for a little over a year. Their relationship ended 2 months before the night she disappeared. Friends described the breakup as calm on the surface, but detectives soon uncovered signs of lingering tension. 2 weeks before Amy vanished, she and Ryan argued in the parking lot of a grocery store. The disagreement wasn't violent, but it was public. A neighbor overheard raised voices and saw Amy walking away quickly while Ryan slammed the door of his pickup. The cause of the fight was simple. Ryan wanted to reconcile. Amy did not. She told him directly that she had moved on. For Ryan, who had a reputation for a short fuse, the rejection stung. That moment gave investigators the first thread of motive: anger, jealousy, and unresolved feelings. When detectives interviewed Amy's colleagues, they repeated the same story. Amy had mentioned the breakup in passing, saying Ryan had taken it hard. She also said he had called her more than once in the weeks after, pressing for another chance. None of this was criminal, but in the early hours of a disappearance, police look for. Ryan told investigators that on the night of November 12th, he was at a friend's house watching an NFL game. The game had kicked off at 9 o'clock. Several people were present, drinking beer and watching television. For most of the evening, Ryan's presence was confirmed. But between 9:50 and 10:25, the timeline grew thin. One witness said Ryan stepped outside for a cigarette. Another said he left briefly to grab something from his truck. No one could account for his movements with precision during the critical half-hour when Amy vanished from the school lot. Phone records added another layer. At 10:32, Ryan's home landline received a call from one of his friends. Investigators noted that the call suggested Ryan was at home soon after the disappearance window. But it also left a gap. Could Ryan have left his friend's house, interconnected Amy, and returned home by that time? Theoretically, yes. Proving it, however, was another matter. Detectives turned to his vehicle, a pickup truck fitted with all-terrain tires. Tire marks had been seen faintly on the pavement near the school's side gate. But when analysts compared the impressions, they found they were too narrow, too faint to have come from Ryan's heavier truck. His tires were large and distinct. The marks didn't match. A search of his vehicle found nothing useful. The carpets were dry, showing no sign of mud from Briar Lake or the surrounding roads. The seats carried no unusual fibers, stains, or evidence. Forensic teams scoured the bed of the truck, looking for traces of Amy's Civic or personal belongings. They found nothing. His house offered no better leads. Officers found no spare keys, no burglary tools, nothing linking him to Amy's missing car. If Ryan had been involved, he had left no trace. Even so, suspicion lingered. Investigators asked Ryan to take a polygraph. He agreed. The results were inconclusive, fluctuations that could be read as stress, but not as deception beyond doubt. Courts don't accept polygraphs as hard evidence, but in the court of public opinion, the shadow was enough. Ryan became the villain in whispers around Briarwood. Local tabloids ran headlines painting him as the dangerous ex-boyfriend. Neighbors whispered about the argument at the grocery store.
The evidence tied to her life built a picture that was impossible to ignore. She had work planned. She had appointments scheduled. She had spoken to her family just hours before. She had finished her grading and was preparing for the next school day. She had a clear routine, a fixed route home, and habits everyone around her knew well. The portrait that emerged was not of someone trying to escape her life, but of someone living it steadily, step by step, until the moment it stopped. For investigators, that left only one conclusion. If Amy had not chosen to walk away, then something or someone interrupted her routine. That possibility grew stronger when they reviewed her personal items left behind in the school. Her purse was still in the faculty room. Her wallet and identification had not been touched. All that was missing was Amy and her Civic. In the early days of the case, some reports suggested she may have driven away on her own. But that idea didn't hold. Why leave behind her purse and plans? Why leave lesson materials ready for the morning? Why call her mother and message a colleague if she never intended to come back? Those facts contradicted any theory of voluntary disappearance. The weight of these details pressed investigators toward another conclusion. Amy had intended to go home that night. She had walked into the parking lot expecting a 12-minute drive, nothing more. Instead, she was gone within minutes. That contrast between the calm order of her life and the sudden blank space in the timeline made the case gripping. It framed every later question. If someone interfered, how did they do it? And why was there so little evidence left behind? Amy Whitaker's portrait was not that of a troubled young woman. It was the portrait of stability, and that stability made her disappearance in the shadows of Maple Hollow Elementary even more unsettling. The answers would not come quickly. For years, the case remained a cold trail. But one detail at the crime scene, overlooked in the first reports, would eventually shift everything. A scrap of carbon paper, pulled from a stack of recycling, holding a code meant for cutting a spare key. That fragment, ignored in 1999, would later pull the case back into focus and expose the truth. When investigators stepped back from Ryan Cole, they didn't have to look far for the next name. Inside Maple Hollow Elementary itself worked a man with keys to every door, codes for every lock, and knowledge of every shortcut in the building. His name was Carl Benson. Carl was 45 in 1999. He had worked at the school for more than a decade as the maintenance man. Everyone in Briarwood knew him. The man in blue coveralls, carrying his toolbox, fixing lights, clearing snow, or repairing the old boiler. He was dependable, but he also carried a reputation. Gruff, impatient, and openly frustrated with his job. More than one teacher had overheard him complain about low pay or disrespect from administration. To detectives, Carl seemed like a natural suspect. He had a badge key that let him access every hallway and every exit. He knew the schedules of staff, including which teachers often stayed late. And he had a history of small conflicts at work.
The most striking of those conflicts involved Amy herself. Months before she vanished, Amy had reported cigarette smoke drifting into her classroom from the utility corridor. The source was Carl, caught smoking in a restricted area. She filed a complaint through the school office. It wasn't a major violation, but it embarrassed Carl, and colleagues remembered that he didn't take it well. More than once, he muttered about Amy being too strict or thinking she ran the place. The investigators, that history mattered. A young teacher who embarrassed him in front of management could have been a trigger. On the night of November 12th, Carl's access card told part of the story. He clocked in at 7:03 p.m. He clocked out at 9:47 p.m. And then, at 10:25 p.m., he returned to shut down the power in the gym. Those gaps lined up in troubling ways. Amy left the school around 10 o'clock. The guard reported hearing an engine at 10:05. If Carl had remained nearby after clocking out, he would have been in the perfect position to intercept her. Detectives pressed the point. Where had Carl been between 9:50 and 10:25? His answer: the maintenance room. He said he stayed to log readings on the power meters and tidy equipment. At first, it sounded like an excuse.
Police examined Carl's work boots. They collected soil samples from the tread and compared them with the sandy grit found near the west exit. The match wasn't there. His boots carried ordinary dust from the boiler room, not the fine outdoor particles at the scene. They looked at his pickup truck, an older model parked at his house. The night after Amy vanished, it had been caught in light rain. The hood and bed were damp, but the undercarriage was bone dry. Detectives concluded the truck had not been down the muddy slope to Briar Lake, the very slope where later suspicion would turn. Then came the tools. Police carefully examined Carl's toolbox, the same one he had carried for years. Wrenches, screwdrivers, crowbars, wire cutters, everything a maintenance man would use. They compared them with the shallow pry marks on the west exit door. The match wasn't there. The tool that created those marks was different in shape and size, the kind more often used in auto glass work than building maintenance. Still, investigators weren't ready to let go. They brought Carl in for questioning multiple times. He answered, but his frustration showed. He felt targeted for doing his job. When the school suspended him pending investigation, his anger grew worse. The union lawyer intervened, warning police not to harass a man without evidence. Meanwhile, whispers spread through Briarwood. Parents muttered about the maintenance man with keys to every door. Local papers hinted at secrets behind the school walls. The man who held the master key, one headline read, implying guilt without proof. Yet, the longer the case dragged on, the thinner the file against Carl looked. The soil samples, the dry truck, the unmatched tools, all pointed away from him. The alibi in the maintenance room, backed by meter logs and a co-worker's statement, carried real weight. And, perhaps most importantly, nothing tied him to Amy's car. No witness ever saw him near her Honda Civic. No evidence linked him to the idea of a duplicate key. By the time prosecutors reviewed the file, they came to the same conclusion as with Ryan Cole. There wasn't enough to move forward. Motive existed in the form of work disputes and personal resentment. But motive without evidence is not a case. In the years that followed, This stage of the case shows how easily an investigation can lean on what feels obvious. The maintenance man with keys becomes the easy target. But evidence is stubborn. It refuses to bend to theory. And in this case, it quietly ruled him out. By the mid-2000s, Carl was no longer an active suspect. Police admitted they had nothing solid on him. His role in the story became a shadow, important enough to confuse the public, but not enough to solve the crime. The lingering question remained. If Ryan Cole, the jealous ex-boyfriend, wasn't the one, and Carl Benson, the man with master access, wasn't the one either, then who was left?
The answer would lie in a figure on the edge of the community, someone who didn't belong to the school staff but was seen around its parking lot. A man with skills that fit the evidence better than anyone else. A drifter in a white van, working odd jobs, able to cut keys from codes and slip into cars without a sound. Coming next, Part 6. The name that had been overlooked. A locksmith and auto glass worker who could turn a strip of carbon paper into a key, and a key into a disappearance. Evan Pike was not a teacher. He was not a security guard. He was not even on the payroll of Maple Hollow Elementary. Yet, his name would eventually appear in the case file, tucked away in the margins, where most people didn't bother to look. At the time in 1999, he was 32 years old. A drifter in work and in life, earning a living as a mobile locksmith and auto glass repairman.
His van was his workshop. A white, weathered panel van with a side door that stuck on humid days and paint flaking near the fenders. The license plate was half rusted, numbers dulled by grime. It was the kind of vehicle you might pass without remembering. In Briarwood, several residents recalled seeing a white van that fall, but no one bothered to write down the plate. Pike's trade was simple, but it gave him access to things most people never thought about. He serviced small car dealerships and garages across the county. His specialty was cutting keys from printed codes and replacing cracked windows. His invoices were scribbled on scraps of carbon copy paper. Many were marked cash job. He wasn't big on records, and he wasn't the kind of contractor who showed up in a database years later when investigators went back through official files. At Maple Hollow Elementary, staff had seen him before. Sometimes in the bus yard, fitting new glass into a broken window. Sometimes in the parking lot, swapping out cracked side mirrors. He wasn't part of the school, but he wasn't a stranger either. That was his advantage. His presence didn't raise questions. A van parked by the gym? A man in coveralls moving around the lot? People barely looked twice. When detectives revisited the original case notes, one item stood out in hindsight. The carbon copy key code sheets stacked on the guard's desk. Mixed in with recycling paper, they were written off as office junk. But buried in those scraps was a strip of carbon that read, Civic 97, cut spare, followed by a series of numbers. That code wasn't random. It was the exact byte pattern for the lock of Amy Whitaker's Honda Civic. At the time, no one paid attention. The police leaned on the theory that Amy must have been taken by someone she knew. An ex-boyfriend, a coworker, maybe a jealous acquaintance. The idea that a stranger could simply pull a key code from a carbon sheet, cut a spare, and drive off in her car seemed too far-fetched. But to Pike, it was standard practice. Locksmiths of his Pike wasn't clean on paper either. He had a record from his teenage years: petty theft, shoplifting, stealing a set of tools from a hardware store. Nothing violent, nothing serious enough to keep him from working jobs where people didn't check too closely. Those juvenile charges were expunged by the time he turned 21, but they painted a picture. A man who knew how to take things that weren't his. Despite the loose ends, Pike was not seen as a major suspect in 1999. Investigators were pulled toward Ryan Cole, the ex-boyfriend, and then to Carl Benson, the maintenance man. Both had obvious ties to Amy and the school. Pike, on the other hand, was a contractor who came and went. There was no clear connection between him and Amy, no record of interaction, no direct link to her disappearance. That was enough for detectives to let his name fade to the background. The failure lay in assumptions. Because Pike wasn't on staff, his van was treated as background noise. Because his invoices were handwritten and messy, they never entered the chain of evidence. Because his past was buried in juvenile records, he looked clean on paper. Every factor that should have made him suspicious was the same set of factors that helped him slide under the radar. Years later, when the file was reopened, those details came back with new weight. The carbon strip that once looked like trash became a lead. The van sighting that sounded ordinary became suspicious. The skill set that seemed irrelevant suddenly matched the mechanics of the crime. Pike didn't need to know Amy. He only needed the code. In the moment, though, all of that was lost. Reporters never mentioned his name. Police never called him in for extended questioning. He wasn't the man splashed across tabloids as the jealous ex. He wasn't the school employee suspended during an internal review. He was just a contractor, somewhere on the edge of town, cashing jobs and keeping receipts in a glove box. Looking back, it's easy to see how close he was to the heart of the case. His van fit the sighting. His work gave him access to the exact type of code found at the school. His method explained how Amy's car disappeared without forced entry. But in 1999, the file labeled Evan Pike gathered dust, while other names filled headlines. That decision, choosing to see him as noise instead of signal, would cost investigators 2 decades. It meant that while the families grieved, while the community tore itself apart with rumors, the man who had the tools, the skill, and the opportunity walked free. He blended back into everyday life, his van just another white box rolling down county roads. Only when time shifted the landscape, when the water levels at Briar Lake dropped, when old papers in the library archives were dusted off, did Pike's role move from the margins to the center. But in 1999, he was a ghost at the edge of the case, unimportant, unseen, overlooked. And yet, he was there. 2 decades later, the overlooked vows would return. The carbon strip, the van sighting, the memory of a name barely written into the case notes. All of it would resurface, changing the course of the investigation forever. Because in the end, Evan Pike wasn't just a side character. He was the missing piece. Evan Pike faded into the background in 1999. But 2 decades later, it wasn't police work or new technology that brought him back into focus. It was nature itself, when Briar Lake gave up its secret. What do you think investigators will find under the waterline? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you're following the case closely, and subscribe so you don't miss part 7, when the lake changes everything. In the fall of 2019, 2 decades after Amy Whitaker vanished, Briar County faced its worst drought in years. Briar Lake, once full and calm, was drawn down to reinforce the dam. As the water line dropped, silted ground and broken tree stumps began to show. For the first time in decades, the lake bed lay exposed. That was when workers spotted something metallic half buried in the mud. At first, it looked like scrap or an old guardrail. But when the excavator pulled back, a rear bumper emerged. Then a trunk. Then the frame of a car coated in algae and rust. When the winch brought it out, the truth was immediate. It was a 1997 Honda Civic. The same model Amy Whitaker had driven the night she disappeared. The car had been underwater for 20 years. The interior was destroyed. The seats collapsed, the fabric rotted, the dashboard barely intact.
Any fingerprints or blood traces were long gone. Investigators tried swabs, but no DNA could be salvaged. Still, the license plate and VIN number confirmed the find. It was Amy's car. For the Whitaker family, the discovery reopened a wound they had carried since 1999. But it also proved something no theory had been able to erase. Amy never left by choice. Her car had been forced into the water. A few days later, another clue surfaced, literally by accident. A fisherman snagged something while casting near the boat ramp. When he reeled it in, a small, rusted key ring clattered onto the dock. The ring carried corroded keys and a
Investigators compared the numbers on that strip to Amy's recovered Honda Civic. The match was exact. The carbon sheet recorded a spare key order for her car dated only 2 days before she disappeared. That scrap of paper, ignored back in 1999, now stood as a critical link. At the time, it had been dismissed as trash on the guard's desk. 2 decades later, it was the piece that tied the Civic in the lake to someone who had access to her key code. The team dug deeper. They tracked down an old ledger from a small dealership in Briar County. There, scribbled in the same month Amy vanished, was an entry. Cut spare, cash. No name attached, no proper invoice, just a note of payment. And then another voice entered the story. The owner of the Briar Lake boat launch, now in his 70s, came forward after hearing news of the Civic's recovery. He remembered a white van parked at the launch on the night Amy disappeared. Not just any van. This one had a magnet on the door. It read, "Glass and lock." He even had a $1 receipt from that night. The memory had faded, but the paperwork gave it weight. Cold case detectives mapped the possible route. From Maple Hollow Elementary down a dark service lane beside the school, onto a back road that led straight to Briar Lake. That road had no traffic cameras in 1999. The van could have left the school parking lot, slipped through the side street, and reached the lake unnoticed. With the Civic in their custody and the carbon strip in hand, the family demanded action. They filed a petition urging the county to reopen the case, and this time, the sheriff agreed. A dedicated cold case unit was formed, pulling together veteran detectives and forensic specialists. They rebuilt the case from the ground up. Ryan Cole, the ex-boyfriend, had never had access to Amy's key code. Carl Benson, the maintenance worker, had keys to the school but no means of opening her Civic. But the carbon slip told another story. Someone had copied the exact pattern of Amy's car key. Someone had walked into a dealership, paid cash, and walked out with the ability to unlock her Civic in silence. The focus shifted from the people closest to Amy to someone at the edge of the investigation all along. A man who had blended into the background. A traveling locksmith and auto glass repairman. He drove a white van. He took small jobs for cash. And he was known to pick up carbon slips left behind at dealerships. His name was Evan Pike. For 20 years, he had been a vague note in old reports, brushed off as a side figure. But now, each fragment of evidence pointed his way. The Civic at the bottom of Briar Lake. The rusted key ring. The carbon sheet with Amy's code. The van with glass and lock magnets. It was not technology that resurrected this case. No DNA miracle, no advanced digital forensics. Instead, it was water levels dropping, a fisherman's cast, and a librarian's persistence that shifted the entire investigation. By the end of 2021 scene, the pieces lined up. What was once dismissed as coincidence
now read like a road map. The Civic's presence in the lake showed the end of Amy's night. The carbon slip showed how her car had been accessed. And the witness memory of a van at the boat launch put that knowledge in someone's hands. 20 years of silence ended with ordinary details, speaking louder than Amy's case was alive again. The man once seen as background noise was no longer invisible. The cold case team prepared their move. They would soon confront Evan Pike with evidence that had waited 20 years beneath water, paper, and memory. And as they closed in, the question shifted. Not whether Amy had been taken. That was clear now. The question became, who carried her Civic, and why he thought it would never.
The next breakthrough came from a surprising source, Evan's ex-wife. Divorced years earlier, she still had a storage unit filled with his old belongings. She contacted detectives, saying she wanted to help. Inside a dusty box were his old locksmith tools. Among them was a slim metal wedge, worn from use, and a handful of magnetic signs that once read glass and lock. They were the kind you could slap on the side of a van and peel off just as easily. Forensic technicians compared the wedge to crime scene photos from 1999. The photos showed faint pry marks on the west exit door of Maple Hollow Elementary. When they overlaid the marks with the width of Evan's wedge, the fit was precise. The scratches matched the tool's edges. It was not just similar, it was identical in dimension. That wasn't the only match. Cold case detectives tracked down old gas station receipts, archived on microfilm. One receipt jumped out. A purchase made at 9:41 p.m. on November 17, 1999, at a station less than 3 miles from the school. The card used was tied to a loyalty account under the name Glass and Lock, Evan's small business at the time. It placed him in the area at the exact window Amy vanished. Next came a human memory. Investigators interviewed the retired owner of Briar Lake Marina. He remembered one night vividly. A white van with a magnetic sign pulled into the lot, close to midnight. The sign had rounded corners, unlike most others. The man recalled the words glass and lock. He had written a $1 boat ramp fee on a slip dated November 17, 1999. That piece of paper had survived in his personal boxock of receipts, faded but legible. Detectives didn't stop there. They revisited the carbon strip that had surfaced during cold case dock day. On it were notations for a Civic 97 spare key. Alongside the numbers were handwritten ticks, small gashes in the paper Powell made by a pen pressing too hard. A handwriting analyst compared them to Evan's old order books, also found in the storage unit. The style was identical. Evan had a habit of slashing through numbers in a way that was unmistakable. The carbon strip, dismissed as trash in 1999. From there, detectives believed Evan drove the Civic along a side road that bypassed the main cameras. The route ended at Briar Lake. The ramp was deserted. Evan guided the car into the water, leaving Amy trapped inside. He then left in his own van, magnetic sign removed, vanishing into the night. Meanwhile, 2 men had lived for years under suspicion. Ryan Cole, the ex-boyfriend, and Carl Benson, the maintenance worker. Both had endured decades of whispers, of neighbors crossing the street, of being called killers without proof. In 2022, investigators finally cleared them. The district attorney's office issued a formal statement. Neither man had any role in Amy's disappearance. The DA apologized publicly, acknowledging that Ryan and Carl had carried a burden they did not deserve. For Ryan, it ended 20 years of headlines branding him the angry ex. For Carl, it ended suspicions that he had used his master key to harm a teacher. The focus turned entirely to Evan Pike.
Detectives built a file filled with small, ordinary details that together became overwhelming. The pry marks, the wedge, the gas rete, the carbon strip, the marina fee slip, the handwriting analysis. Each one, on its own, might have been explained away, but together, they formed a chain that was impossible to ignore. The county issued an arrest warrant. Evan Pike, now in his 50s, was taken into custody. He faced charges of kidnapping resulting in death, evidence tampering, and abuse of a corpse. In court, prosecutors laid out the case. There was no single smoking gun, no DNA, no eyewitness who saw Amy taken. But there was a web of consistent, physical and circumstantial evidence that tied Evan to the crime. Faced with this mountain, Evan had few options. His defense argued the evidence was circumstantial, but the jury saw the pattern. The gas receipt at the wrong place and time, the wedge that fit the pry marks, the carbon strip with his handwriting style, the marina owner who remembered his van. In the end, Evan accepted a plea deal to avoid a full trial. He admitted to
After more than 20 years, the name that had hovered at the edge of the file finally took center stage. Evan Pike, the drifter locksmith, the man in the white van. His shadow, once barely noticed, now defined the story. And yet, one question lingered. How had such a small trail of overlooked details taken so long to connect? That question was left for the town and the justice system to wrestle with. 2 decades off track, and at last, the truth had surfaced. But what happened to the town of Briarwood after the verdict? How did a community haunted for so long learn to live with the truth? The case that haunted Briarwood for more than 2 decades finally closed in 2022. The trial of Evan Pike ended with a guilty plea, and for the first time, the Whitaker family could grieve without doubt. What came next was not just the end of a case. It was the reshaping of a town, a justice system, and the way people thought about details too small to matter. After the sentencing, Amy's parents stood at Maple Hollow Elementary, the school where their daughter had once taught second graders. A modest brick wall near the playground now carried a bronze plaque. In memory of Amy Whitaker, 1973 to 1999. Teacher, daughter, remembered forever. Each year on the anniversary of her disappearance, flowers are placed there by students, colleagues, and parents. The school created the Amy Whitaker Scholarship, given to student teachers entering elementary education. For the family, it was a way of turning grief into legacy. But the story was not just about Amy. It was also about 2 men who had lived under suspicion for 20 years. Ryan Cole, the ex-boyfriend, and Carl Benson, the maintenance worker. Both had faced whispers in grocery stores, stares at community events, and newspaper headlines that tied their names to Amy's disappearance. When the district attorney stood in front of reporters and said the words, "We were wrong," the weight lifted, but the scars remained. The town rallied. A community fund was created to help. Maple Hollow Elementary itself transformed. Every parking lot light was replaced with high-output LEDs. Digital cameras covered every entry point, feeding directly to a central server with cloud backup. Teachers who stayed late no longer walked out alone. A security escort system was put in place, making sure no one repeated the walk Amy had taken that night. What began as a response to one tragedy soon spread. Other schools in the county adopted the same model.
a lasting mark of a crime that should never have happened. Police learned too. The cold case unit issued new rules. All paper archives would be reviewed on rotation. Retired librarians and local volunteers joined officers in scanning old files, refining sure small items like carbon slips would never again sit ignored in a box. The department emphasized that not every answer comes from DNA or databases. Sometimes it comes from a handwritten note, added receipt, or the memory of someone who thought they had nothing important to share. The story also had an impact on the family of Evan Pike. His arrest and conviction brought closure to the Whitakers, but his own family faced a different kind of sentence. His wife had already left him years earlier. His children, now adults, chose to change their last names. They lived under a shadow they did not create, but could not escape. Sway Services offered counseling and support, trying to keep them from being crushed by a crime they did not commit. In the media, the case became a phenomenon. Podcasts dissected the timeline. Documentaries showed the footage of Briar Lake being drained, the Civic rising from the mud. Local newspapers gave the case a name, the carbon slip case. It was not the forensics of the future that solved it, but the paper trail of the past. That phrase became a symbol, reminding investigators everywhere not to ignore the ordinary. For Briarwood, the impact was personal. The town had lived with rumors and mistrust since 1999. Neighbors had turned on each other. Parents had whispered warnings. Every new family that moved in was told the story. A teacher vanished from our school one night. Reconciliation, no one knew who to trust. The resolution in 2022 gave time, relief.
That was the real message. Justice is not always about breakthroughs in labs or brand new science. Sometimes it's about the little things we walk past. A scrap of carbon paper, a memory of a van parked too close to the water, a $1 receipt left in a drawer. Small details, easily dismissed, but powerful when they finally connect. The Whitaker case became a civic lesson. Officers spoke about it in training seminars. Schools used it as a teaching moment about vigilance and safety. Community groups repeated the same point. Do not overlook the everyday. The smallest thing might carry the truth. 23 years after Amy walked across that dark parking lot, her case ended not just with a guilty plea, but with a transformation. Briarwood went from a town consumed by suspicion to a community rebuilt on trust and reform. And Amy's name, once tied only to tragedy, became a symbol of protection, resilience, and justice earned through patience. The story closes here, but the message is lasting. Justice can take decades. It can stumble, fail, and mislead. But it can also rise, piece by piece, from the water, from paper, from memory. And now, it's your turn. What do you think was the piece that changed everything? Was it the carbon slip that everyone ignored? The fisherman's hook that pulled up the key ring? Or the low water at Briar Lake that exposed the car? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Like this video. Subscribe for more cases where justice came from the smallest of details, and join us in the next chapter, where we break down, minute by minute, the night Amy vanished and the trial that finally brought the truth to light. 2 decades of silence ended with one conviction, but the real story is in the details that were almost forgotten. Which one do you believe truly cracked the case? An old carbon slip, a $1 receipt, or the memory of a van at the lake? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you think justice was finally served, and subscribe so you don't miss our full minute-by-minute reconstruction of the night Amy disappeared.